The Force is old and full of shadows.
The Coruscant skyline never darkened. Not truly. Even at the third hour past midnight, the planet city burned, 10,000 lanes of traffic bleeding orange and white across a sky that had forgotten what stars looked like. From the 210th floor of the Damask Holdings residential suite, it looked less like a civilization and more like a circulatory system. Veins of light, arteries of commerce. A living thing that did not know it had a new heart. Diego Damask stood at the transparisteel window, with his hands clasped behind his back, and watched it breathe. He had attended 4 sessions of the Trade Federation Financial Summit that week. He would attend 2 more before departing. The Naboo blockade was, on its surface, a tedious dispute over taxation routes, the kind of commercial grievance that kept junior banking clan analysts employed and senior ones bored. But surfaces were for architects' clients. Plagueis cared about the foundation. The blockade was Sidious's work. His apprentice had grown ambitious, and ambition in a Sith apprentice was a variable Plagueis had been monitoring with increasing clinical detachment. Sheev Palpatine, senator, rising political ornament of the Chamal sector, secret architect of the very blockade currently consuming the summit's agenda, had long nursed a specific contempt for the Naboo aristocracy, the entitled machinery of a planet that had once believed itself beneath consequence. He had spent 2 decades constructing the most elaborate political instrument in the history of manufactured crisis. The goal was not strategy, it was demonstration. Sidious wanted to prove, to no one but himself, that the system bent when he chose to bend it. Plagueis exhaled through his nose. Quietly, Sidious was extraordinarily capable. He was also, Plagueis had concluded sometime in the last 3 years, a precision instrument that had developed a tremor. The grand design, economic capture of the Republic, the long patience of decades, the Sith plan that operated through compound interest rather than open war, did not require a political coup staged around a personal fixation. It required control. Sidious wanted theater. He did not yet know his master had begun calculating the cost of the theater against the cost of the alternative. He turned from the window. 11-4D waited near the door in the deferential stillness that made the medical droid more useful than any organic aid Plagueis had ever employed. No curiosity, no ambition, no tremor. The summit reconvenes at 8th hour, Plagueis said. Cancel my attendance. The Trade Federation delegation will note the absence. Magister, yes. He crossed to the low table and poured 2 fingers of Corellian wine he had no intention of drinking. Let them wonder. Wondering keeps the fee current. He set the glass down untouched. And stopped. It was not sound. It was not movement. It was the Force shifting the way a conversation shifts when someone in the room says something true. A quality change, not a volume change. Plagueis had catalogued thousands of Force signatures across his decades of research. Powerful ones registered like struck bells, clear and resonant. Dark side practitioners radiated heat. Jedi Masters carried the deep, regular pulse of a well-maintained engine. This was none of those things. This was saturation, not loudness. The difference between a shout and a room so completely filled with sound that the air itself had changed composition. He stood still for 4 seconds, which was the longest Plagueis had held still involuntarily in 30 years. Then he moved to the window again, not to look at the skyline, but to feel along the thread the Force had handed him. It came from below, far below, the mid-levels where Coruscant's circulatory metaphor broke down, and what remained was simply sediment, the residue of 10,000 years of civilization piling on top of itself until the bottom layers had never seen unfiltered light. Markets. Transient labor pools. The particular misery of people who had arrived at the galaxy's capital and discovered the capital had no room for them. He dressed without calling for assistance. The plain gray coat of a mid-tier banking administrator. The kind of coat that said, "I have enough money, that I no longer need to look like I have money." He left 11-4D with instructions and took a private lift to the street. The mid-level market occupied a vaulted concourse 2 kilometers beneath the skylane he had been watching. It smelled of machine oil and fried protein, and the specific humidity of too many bodies in recycled air. Vendors called prices in 6 languages. A Toydarian merchant in a stained apron levitated above a collection of second-hand parts, watching his stall with the particular vigilance of a being who had been robbed before and expected to be robbed again. Plagueis walked the perimeter of the stall once without looking at it. The boy was working. 9 years old, perhaps 10. Moon aging was difficult to apply to human children. But the frame was small, the face angular in the way that suggested the bone structure would eventually be striking. He moved through the scrap with the unconscious efficiency of someone for whom the work had become physical grammar: reach, assess, sort, discard, while simultaneously tracking 3 separate customers and a back-wall display screen running a pod racing results crawl. He was not using the Force. He did not know he was using the Force. This was the detail that arrested Plagueis completely. He had noted, in passing, something unusual about the boy's presence in the market. Not his skill, not his efficiency, but the simple fact of him. A human child working a Toydarian's parts stall in the Coruscant mid-levels had arrived here somehow, from somewhere. The way all the sediment in the lower city had arrived, carried by circumstances that rarely involved a choice. The Force had not led Plagueis to a comfortable life. It had led him to this concourse, to this stall, to a child sorting scrap components with the instincts of something far older than his frame suggested. He stopped thinking about the arrival. He thought about what he was looking at. Decades of research. 14 failed subjects, each possessed of genuine Force sensitivity, each introduced to midi-chlorian manipulation theory at carefully staged intervals, each producing results that were competent, incremental, the results of students learning a difficult language in adulthood, technically correct, fundamentally accented. His droid's files on those subjects occupied 3 data cores in a vault on a moon the Senate believed was rubble. The boy reached for a component on the second shelf without looking, and caught it before it fell. 1 full second before gravity had finished its argument. He hadn't thought about it. The hand had simply known. Plagueis stood still in the middle of a moving crowd, and understood, with the cold finality of a proof resolving on a calculation board, what he was looking at. Not a student. Not a subject. Not the next iteration of an experiment that had produced 14 failures and was now attempting its 15th. The Force had been listening to his questions for 60 years. This was the answer. Not constructed in a laboratory, conceived, the theoretical endpoint of midi-chlorian saturation given biological form, given a name, given a Toydarian employer who was currently yelling at him for handling a customer inquiry without permission. The boy absorbed the reprimand with a patience that did not belong to a 9-year-old and returned to sorting components. Plagueis bought a power coupling he didn't need and handed the credits to the Toydarian without negotiating, which briefly broke the merchant's entire psychological model of commercial interaction. He walked to the second shelf. The boy looked up. The eyes were the color of deep-water sky on a planet with 2 suns. Clear, watchful, already doing the calculation that Plagueis himself had run a moment ago. Who is this? What does he want? How do I be useful? With a speed that bypassed whatever the boy thought was normal human cognition. You caught that component, Plagueis said. Before it fell. A pause. The merchant was occupied elsewhere. The boy looked at him the way intelligent children looked at adults who had noticed something they weren't sure they were supposed to have noticed. I do that sometimes, the boy said. I know. Plagueis set the power coupling on the shelf between them. Gently, my name is Diego Damask. I am a very boring banker who is extremely interested in people who do things they cannot explain. He allowed a pause of exactly the right length. What is yours? Another beat. The watchfulness shifted. Not fear, not excitement, but the specific quality of attention a mind produces when it encounters a question that might actually be worth answering. Anakin, the boy said. Anakin Skywalker. Plagueis turned the name over once in his mind. Skywalker. The kind of surname that sounded invented, and probably wasn't. It didn't matter. He looked at the boy for a moment longer than social convention required, which was deliberate, and then said, I wonder, Anakin Skywalker, whether you have ever had someone explain to you exactly why you are the way you are. The answer in the boy's eyes was immediate, unguarded, and entirely human in its hunger. No, never, please. Plagueis picked up the power coupling and placed it back in the boy's hands. I have time before my next meeting, he said. Walk with me. Behind him, unseen, 3 lanes of traffic moved in their endless circuits above a planet that had no idea what had just begun. The shuttle Plagueis chartered was unmarked and filed no passenger manifest. This was not unusual for Damask Holdings Transit. The Magister's personal travel records had contained deliberate gaps for 40 years, a habit so consistent that banking clan auditors had long since stopped noting the anomaly and simply coded it as a standing eccentricity of the extremely wealthy. The crew of 2 asked no questions. They had been selected, in part, for that quality. Anakin sat across from him in the cabin and looked out the viewport with the focused stillness of a child who had decided that the correct response to an overwhelming situation was to observe everything and betray nothing. The stars stretched and compressed as the shuttle made the jump to hyperspace. His hands rested on his knees. He had not fidgeted once in the 40 minutes since they had left the mid-level market. Plagueis noted this. You're not going to ask where we're going, he said. You said it was somewhere quiet. Anakin kept his eyes on the hyperspace tunnel. I figured if you wanted me to know more, you'd have said more. Plagueis studied him for a moment. The boy was 9 years old. He spoke like someone who had learned early that information was a resource distributed unevenly, and that demanding more than you were given was a reliable way to receive less. Sojourn, Plagueis said. A private moon. The Senate knows of one version of it. We are going to the other. Anakin turned from the viewport. There are 2. There is one that exists in records. And one that exists. He let that sit. The distinction is more common than most people realize. The boy considered this with the same patient attention he had given the component shelf. Then he nodded, once, as though filing it under a category he already possessed. Sojourn from the landing approach looked like a bruise in space, dark forests pressing up to the edge of a facility that had been built to disappear into them, rather than announce itself above them. No towers, no beacon lights beyond the minimum required for navigation. The architecture, where it was visible at all, was the color of the rock it sat on, black veined stone that had been here long enough to stop looking constructed. The landing bay doors opened from below. The shuttle descended into light. Inside was a different proposition entirely. The facility's interior ran counter to everything its exterior suggested. Vaulted ceilings of pale stone, lit from recessed channels that produced something close to natural light without the directional bluntness of artificial panels. The floors were black marble, veined with silver, cold and frictionless underfoot. Every corridor was precisely wide enough for 2 people to walk without crowding, and too narrow for 3 to walk abreast. An architectural choice that enforced, quietly, that meetings here were always bilateral, always direct. 11-4D waited at the base of the landing ramp. The droid's photoreceptors moved to Anakin and held there for 3 seconds, a scan that produced no visible result and was not commented upon. Prepare the orientation suite, Plagueis said. Already prepared, Magister. Shall I include the sequencing display? Yes, all of it. Anakin looked at the droid the way he had looked at the hyperspace tunnel, with the particular quality of attention that was not wonder exactly, but its more disciplined cousin. He said nothing. He followed. The room Plagueis had built for this purpose occupied a lower level of the facility, where the stone walls were oldest, and the temperature dropped 4 degrees below the rest of the complex. Not cold enough to be uncomfortable, cold enough to be noticed, a subtle, continuous reminder that the body was a physical object operating within physical parameters, which was, in a sense, the entire point of the room. One wall was glass. Behind it, a cylindrical column of pale blue liquid held something. Anakin stood in front of the glass for a long time before he said anything. What is that? A culture medium, Plagueis said. What you are seeing suspended inside it are midi-chlorians. Isolated. Alive. Separate from any host organism for the first time in the history of this research. He came to stand beside the boy. What do you feel when you look at them? The boy's brow drew together. Not confusion. Concentration. He pressed one hand flat against the glass, not dramatically, just the way a person reaches towards something they are trying to hear better. They know I'm here. Anakin said. Yes, that's... He stopped. Start it again. That shouldn't be possible. They're behind glass. The glass is irrelevant to them, Plagueis said. Glass interrupts light. It does not interrupt what connects living matter to living matter. He watched the boy's face. You have felt this your entire life, I imagine. The sense that things are aware of you before you announce yourself. That the room adjusts before you enter it. A long pause. Outside the column, the blue culture medium moved in its slow circulation, unhurried. My mother thought it was intuition, Anakin said quietly. Your mother was not wrong. She simply did not have the vocabulary for what she was describing. Plagueis moved to the far wall, where a display panel held a sequencing diagram that would have been incomprehensible to any viewer without 20 years of specific preparation. He did not explain it yet. He let the boy look. Intuition is what we call the Force's influence when we have no framework for understanding the influence. What I am going to give you is the framework. Anakin turned from the glass column to the diagram, then back. Then to Plagueis. Why? He said. The question was not suspicious. It was not the strategic wariness of a child who had been offered gifts before and learned what they cost. It was something closer to genuine philosophical inquiry. The question of a mind that had already moved past, can this be real, and arrived at what is the correct model for understanding it. Plagueis had given this answer significant thought, not because the truth was complicated, but because the truth, stated plainly, was the most persuasive thing available, and he had learned decades ago that persuasion and truth were most powerful when they occupied the same sentence. Because you are what my research has been circling for 60 years, he said. Not a talented student, not a promising subject. An answer. He held the boy's gaze. I have been asking a question about the nature of life itself, whether death is a law or merely a habit, and the Force in its way has produced you as a response. I intend to understand what that means, and the only way to understand it is to teach you everything I know, and then watch what you do with it. Anakin was quiet. The column of living midi-chlorians moved in its slow blue current behind him, catching the light. What happened to the other subjects? He said. The question landed without preamble. Plagueis held it for a moment. Most did not survive the early research stages, he said. The methods were imprecise. The understanding was incomplete. He did not look away. I am telling you this, because you will find the records if you look for them, and I prefer you to find them through me, rather than around me. Another long silence. Anakin looked at the far wall, not at the diagram, but at the stone behind it, as though he were looking through the facility to something further away. You're not going to tell me it won't happen to me, the boy said. No, I am going to tell you that you are structurally different from every subject I have worked with, in a way that I believe makes the early stage risks categorically smaller. I am not going to offer you a guarantee I cannot verify. Plagueis tilted his head slightly. You would not believe it if I did. The boy's mouth moved, not quite a smile. The expression of someone who has been correctly read and is deciding whether to resent it or appreciate it. He looked at the glass column one more time. His hand came up again, flat against the surface, and this time the culture medium inside shifted, visibly, subtly, a movement against its own circulation current, bending toward the heat of his palm through glass and distance, and every physical barrier between them. Neither of them remarked on it. Okay, Anakin said. His voice was even. Decided, the voice of someone who had already accepted a thing, and was now simply acknowledging it aloud. Show me the framework. Plagueis looked at the column, at the midi-chlorians pressing toward the boy's hand like something recognizing its own name being called. 60 years. 14 subjects. 3 data cores of failures locked in a vault on a moon the Senate believed was rubble. He turned to the display panel and began. The first lesson had no dramatics. Plagueis sat across from Anakin at a plain stone table in the laboratory's secondary room, smaller than the orientation suite, warmer, lit by a single overhead panel that produced the quality of light found in operating theaters. Functional. Honest. A room that did not pretend the work done inside it was anything other than work. On the table between them, a single transparent canister. Inside it, a living moth beetle from Sojourn's forest floor, its iridescent carapace catching the light in slow pulses as it moved against the glass. "Tell me what you see," Plagueis said. Anakin studied it. "An insect. Tell me what you feel." The boy's eyes shifted focus, not closing, not performing meditation the way Plagueis had watched Jedi initiates perform it, with deliberate ceremony and visible effort. Simply refocusing. The way a lens adjusts. "It's present," Anakin said. "It knows it's enclosed. It doesn't have a word for that. But it's oriented toward the edges. Looking for the edge that isn't there." "Good." Plagueis placed one long-fingered hand beside the canister. "What you are feeling is its midi-chlorian signature. Not its mind. The insect has no mind in any meaningful sense. Its midi-chlorians, however, are in continuous low-frequency communication with the Force, which places them in continuous low-frequency communication with yours." He paused. "You have been receiving this signal your entire life. You simply had no instrument panel to read it on." Anakin looked at his own hands. The gesture was not dramatic. It was the reflex of someone suddenly aware of a sense organ they hadn't known they possessed. "Can I affect it?" he said. "The insect. That is today's question." Plagueis leaned back. "Try." What followed occupied the better part of 4 hours. Plagueis watched without intervention. This was the methodological discipline that had cost him the most to develop, the instinct to correct, to guide, to impose the framework before the subject had exhausted their own native approach. 14 times he had not waited. 14 times he had introduced theory before the subject had finished asking the question theory was meant to answer. The results were in 3 data cores in a vault, and they were the results of his impatience as much as his subject's limitations. He waited. Anakin tried things. Some of them were wrong in ways that were immediately apparent, the concentration too effortful, the approach too direct, a 9-year-old's instinct to push rather than communicate. The moth beetle moved randomly, indifferent. Some of what Anakin tried produced results that Plagueis logged in his memory and said nothing about. Small anomalies, the culture medium in the adjacent room registering a sympathetic vibration on the monitoring equipment. The overhead light fluctuating by 2% for 6 seconds, while the boy's attention was elsewhere. In the 4th hour, Anakin stopped trying. He sat back from the table. His eyes stayed on the canister, but his posture changed. The effort left his shoulders, and his breathing dropped to a lower register, and he looked less like someone attempting something, and more like someone listening to a frequency they had finally found the right dial position for. The moth beetle stopped moving. It did not die. It oriented itself toward Anakin's side of the canister and held there, completely still, in the particular stillness of a thing that has received a signal and is waiting for the next one. Anakin looked up. "I didn't push it," he said. "No, I just asked," he frowned. "That's not the right word either. I made myself available, and it came." Plagueis looked at the canister, at the insect holding its position against the glass, facing the boy with the fixed attention of a compass needle. "In 63 years of research," he said carefully, "I have produced that result twice. Both times required 4 months of preparation and 3 sessions of direct midi-chlorian augmentation." He looked at Anakin. "You have done it in 4 hours. Unaugmented. At 9 years old." The boy absorbed this without pride and without false modesty. He looked at the insect for another moment, then back at Plagueis. "What comes next?" he said. What came next was theory, and theory occupied the following 2 weeks in a rhythm that Plagueis had not experienced since his own training under Darth Tenebris, the specific texture of an intelligence that consumed information, not sequentially, but structurally, building architecture rather than accumulating inventory. He taught Anakin the foundational principle first. Midi-chlorians were not magic. They were not the Force itself. They were mediators, the biological mechanism through which the Force interfaced with living matter, the way a power coupling mediated between a generator and the system it ran. The Force moved through all living things, because all living things contained the mediators. Most beings experienced this as background radiation, a vague sense of place, of presence, of luck or intuition. Force-sensitive beings experienced it as signal over noise, What Plagueis had spent his life learning was the next step, not receiving the signal, but adjusting the transmission. The Jedi teach that the Force has a will, Plagueis said, on the fourth day, walking the facility's lower corridor with Anakin beside him. That the practitioner's role is to listen, to open, to serve as a channel. You don't think that's true? Anakin said. I think it is a useful metaphor for a certain level of practice, the way training wheels are a useful metaphor for balance. And I think the Jedi, in their considerable wisdom, have confused the metaphor for the mechanism and stopped asking what was underneath it. He paused at the corridor's end, where a viewport looked out onto the dark forest. The Force does not have a will in the way a person has a will. It has a bias toward continuation, toward life persisting and propagating and complexifying. The midi-chlorians are the instrument of that bias. He turned to the boy. Which means they can be reasoned with. Anakin stood at the viewport looking at the trees. You said it was like a language. It is like a language. Specifically, it is like a language you were born speaking, and I have spent 6 decades reconstructing from first principles with no native speakers to consult. A pause. Until now. The boy was quiet for a moment. Below them, the forest moved in Sojourn's cold wind. You said you could kill with it, Anakin said. Not with hunger, not with discomfort, with the same flat precision he brought to every factual question. Yes, show me. Plagueis had prepared for this. He had a specimen, a larger subject than the moth beetle, a Sojourn forest rodent held in the laboratory's containment section. He brought Anakin to the room and did not preamble the demonstration. He looked at the creature. He found its midi-chlorian signature, present, quick, the high-frequency scatter of a small mammal's nervous system. He located the cellular cluster governing cardiac function. And he sent, through his own midi-chlorians in a direction most Force practitioners could not locate on a conceptual map. A single, precise instruction. Return to source. The rodent sat down, neatly, as though its legs had simply completed their purpose and retired from service. Its chest rose once more, and did not rise again. No convulsion, no distress signal in the Force, no violence. Anakin looked at the creature for a long time. It didn't suffer, he said. Suffering is imprecise. It is the result of a system registering damage and broadcasting the registration. This did not damage the system. It simply stopped the signal. Plagueis watched the boy's face. The dark side, as the Jedi define it, is emotion weaponized. Anger, fear, grief converted into Force energy. This is not that. This is surgery. The distinction matters. The boy crouched beside the containment barrier, eye level with the dead rodent. What if you made it go the other way? He said. Plagueis looked at him. Instead of telling the midi-chlorians to stop, Anakin said, his voice precise and unhurried, the voice of someone working through a logical proof rather than asking for permission. What if you told them to start again? The question Plagueis had spent 60 years building toward. The question he had asked himself in 14 variations across 14 failed subjects, none of whom had ever arrived at it independently, none of whom had reached it before he introduced it, none of whom had looked at a thing he had just killed and asked, 4 seconds later, with the calm curiosity of a boy who found the universe genuinely interesting, whether it could be put back. He straightened. Sit down, Plagueis said. We are going to be here for a while. 7 years passed the way compound interest passes quietly, in the background, producing results that looked sudden only to those who had not been watching the math. Anakin was 16. He stood at the window of Damask Holdings' Coruscant office suite, a different suite than the one Plagueis had occupied during the Trade Federation summit, 3 floors higher and with a correspondingly better view of the Senate district, and read a financial report with the focused economy of someone for whom reading had long since stopped being about the words and started being about the architecture underneath them. The report concerned a mid-tier shipping conglomerate in the Outer Rim, recently acquired by a Damask Holdings subsidiary through a sequence of debt instruments, so layered that the conglomerate's own board had not understood what was happening until the transfer of controlling interest was already filed with the Commerce Guild. He set it down and looked at the Senate rotunda across the skyway. 7 years. The rotunda had not changed. The Senate had not changed. The Republic had not changed in any way that its citizens would have recognized as change. The same representative bodies, the same procedural rhythms, the same chancellor's office cycling through occupants with the reliable turnover of a hospitality suite. Senator Palpatine of Naboo was currently its most recent tenant, having ascended to the chancellorship 2 years prior through a vote of no confidence in his predecessor. Plagueis had noted the development with the mild interest he reserved for things that confirmed existing analysis. Sidious, operating without his master's resources or patience, had simply done it faster and louder. Anakin found himself less interested in Palpatine than in the rotunda itself. He had been inside it once, accompanying Plagueis to a banking clan consultation that required the Magister's physical presence. He had sat in the observer's gallery above the main chamber and watched 800 delegations performing the elaborate social theater of representative governance. And what had struck him, what had stayed with him across the 2 years since, was not the corruption, which was obvious and well documented in the financial records he read daily. It was the sincerity. The senators who genuinely believed in what they were doing occupied the same chamber as the ones who had been purchased, and neither group could reliably identify the other. And both groups produced identical floor speeches about the common good. The Republic was not broken. That was the thing the financial records kept showing him, over and over, in the way that data showed things when you stopped looking for confirmation of what you already believed. It was not broken. It was operating precisely as designed, as a system that distributed the appearance of power broadly enough to prevent organized resistance, while concentrating the reality of power in the hands of whoever controlled the economic substrate underneath it. The design was the flaw, not a corruption of something pure. The original blueprint. He turned from the window when Plagueis entered. At 70-plus years, his age was not a figure Plagueis volunteered, and Anakin had stopped asking after it stopped being a relevant variable. The moon moved with the unhurried deliberateness of a being who had made peace with the pace of his own body by simply deciding that his body would keep whatever pace he required of it. The midi-chlorian work had done that much, at minimum. The theoretical ceiling was considerably higher. They were both aware of this without discussing it constantly, the way people who live near a mountain are aware of it without mentioning it at every meal. He set a data card on the table beside Anakin's discarded report. "Quat drive yards," he said. Anakin picked it up, scanned it. "They're not in any distress." "No, they are in fact performing exceptionally. 3 new destroyer-class contracts in the last fiscal year, 2 with Republic fleet procurement and 1 with a private security consortium in the Tingle Arm." Plagueis settled into the chair across the table with the specific economy of someone who had decided that all furniture in his vicinity should accommodate him rather than the reverse. Their capital reserves are at a 40-year high. Their board is cohesive and their labor force is stable. Anakin looked up from the data card. "You want to buy something that doesn't need to be sold. I want to own something that currently believes it doesn't need to be owned." A slight distinction in emphasis. There is a difference between a distressed asset and a strategic one. Distressed assets require remediation. Strategic assets require patience. He watched Anakin set the card down. "Walk me through the approach." This was the form their sessions had taken since Anakin's 13th year. Not lecture, not instruction, but Plagueis presenting a situation, and Anakin constructing the solution aloud, while Plagueis listened for the places the logic skipped a step. The skipped steps were rarer now. They had been common at 13, occasional at 14, infrequent at 15. At 16 they appeared only on problems that were genuinely novel, and their appearance was informative rather than corrective. "The board cohesion is the lever," Anakin said. He pulled the data card back. "A unified board of a healthy company has no internal fault lines to work with. So you don't work with the board. You work with what the board is responsible to." He thought for a moment. Their largest institutional shareholder is the Commerce Guild Pension Fund. 17% stake. If that stake moves, the board's accountability structure moves with it. And the Commerce Guild Pension Fund is administered by Subcentral Fiduciary Management, which holds 3 outstanding credit facilities through banking clan subsidiaries. Anakin set the card down again. The pieces were visible now, arranged in their sequence. You call the facilities. Not aggressively, they're not in default. You renegotiate the terms. Extended duration, reduced rate, contingent on fund reallocation to a Damask Holdings managed vehicle. Timeline: 14 months. Longer if the Guild's internal audit cycle creates friction, but the friction is manageable, because the auditors report to a committee whose chair was appointed with Damask Holdings support in the last Guild election. Plagueis was quiet for a moment. 12 months, he said. The audit committee chair is standing for re-election in the 9th month. His opponent has funding we placed 18 months ago for precisely this contingency. The chair will be cooperative before the election regardless of his preferences, because his preferences will be correctly aligned with his survival. Anakin absorbed this. Not with admiration exactly, with the specific quality of attention he gave to a technique that was more elegant than the one he had constructed. Filing it. The Republic, he said, after a moment. The whole structure. Is it the same? Plagueis looked at him. Is it all levers? Anakin continued. He was not asking rhetorically. He was asking the way he had asked about reversing death in the laboratory, as a logical extension of demonstrated principle, following the line of an argument to see where it terminated. Every institution, every Senate seat, every procurement contract, every fleet admiral who needs a shipyard relationship, and every shipyard that needs a fleet contract. Is it levers all the way down? What do you think? The boy. He was not a boy anymore, not in any way that the word accurately described. But Plagueis found the neural shorthand persisted, looked out at the Senate rotunda again. The afternoon light had shifted. The building's facade was moving from gold into the particular gray that preceded Coruscant's artificial dusk cycle. I think, Anakin said slowly, that the galaxy has been operating for 1,000 years on the assumption that the Republic is a political structure with an economic dimension. And I think the correct model is the reverse. He paused. I think it's an economic structure with a political surface, and whoever controls the substrate controls everything above it, and they don't need to control it loudly. The rotunda across the skyway continued its indifferent gleam. The Jedi, Anakin said. Do they understand this? The Jedi understand the Force with considerable sophistication, Plagueis said. They understand power in the sense of direct authority, who commands what, who answers to whom. They do not understand money. A brief pause. In 11 centuries of Republic history, no Jedi Master has ever served on a banking clan oversight committee. No Jedi has ever audited a Commerce Guild fiduciary instrument. They guard the political surface because they can sense malice in a person's heart. They cannot sense a compound interest clause. Anakin looked at the data card on the table. At the rotunda. Back at the card. So the whole Republic, he said with the quiet finality of someone completing a proof, has been available this entire time. Yes, Plagueis said. The artificial dusk settled over the Senate district, and the rotunda's lights came on automatically, one by one, illuminating a structure that had just been, in the span of a single conversation, reclassified in Anakin Skywalker's mind from monument to mechanism. Plagueis watched the boy's face in the changing light and said nothing further. Some understandings needed room to settle before anything was built on top of them. The specimen had been dead for 6 minutes. Plagueis stood at the laboratory bench with his hands behind his back and watched the monitoring equipment confirm what his own senses had already catalogued. Flatline across every biological metric. Midi-chlorian activity at 0. Cellular respiration ceased. The particular quality of stillness that distinguished dead matter from living matter in a way that no instrument had ever improved upon. Describing. The specimen was a sojourn forest cat, larger than the rodent from 7 years ago, more complex, a nervous system with genuine hierarchical organization, cardiac muscle with the density and redundancy of a predator built for sustained effort, a brain structure that included something approximating memory, and something approximating preference. Not sentient, but far enough up the complexity gradient that what Anakin was about to attempt was, in Plagueis' own research history, the equivalent of moving from arithmetic to differential calculus in a single session. Anakin stood across the bench from him. He was 19 now. The angular bone structure the 9-year-old had promised had delivered exactly what the promise implied. A face that had finished becoming itself and arrived at something that read, to most people, as calm. People who looked longer usually revised that to something else. Plagueis had never bothered categorizing it. The face was a surface. What mattered was the architecture underneath. 6 minutes is the threshold, Plagueis said. Beyond 6 minutes of complete cessation, the cellular degradation cascade initiates processes that cannot be reversed through midi-chlorian instruction alone. The cells begin consuming their own organelles. After 12 minutes, the instructions cannot find functioning receivers. So I have 6 minutes, Anakin said. You have technically already used 3 of them in preparation. He paused. You have the remaining 3. Anakin looked at the forest cat. His hands rested flat on the bench surface on either side of the specimen, not touching it. The physical contact was unnecessary, had been unnecessary since he was 14, when the range at which he could conduct midi-chlorian communication had extended past skin contact and kept extending, but the proximity helped with complex work. Plagueis had not told him this. He had arrived at it himself, the same way he had arrived at most things, by trying the harder version first, and noticing what the easier version felt like by comparison. He closed his eyes. Not in the performative way. No visible breath centering, no deliberate relaxation of the shoulders, simply a redirection of attention from the visual field to the one that mattered. Plagueis watched the monitoring equipment. The first 90 seconds produced nothing the equipment could register. Plagueis could feel it regardless, the specific texture of Anakin's force presence when he was working at depth, which was less like pressure and more like a change in the room's acoustic quality. A sense that the air had become slightly more attentive. He had felt this with no other subject. With most of his subjects he had felt effort. Anakin at full concentration felt like the opposite of effort, a state of such complete alignment between intention and mechanism that the effort had been absorbed into the background and what remained was simply function. At the 90-second mark, the monitoring equipment registered a flicker, not a flatline interruption. A flicker beneath the flatline, a sub-threshold signal in the midi-chlorian activity sensor, lasting 0.4 of a second, too brief and too weak to qualify as revival by any clinical definition. But present, in a specimen that had been dead for 7.5 minutes. Plagueis noted the time and did not speak. At 2 minutes and 14 seconds, the flicker returned. Longer, a full 2 seconds of sub-threshold activity, clustered in the cardiac region. The cellular respiration sensor remained at 0, but something in the chest of the dead forest cat was receiving a signal and attempting, at the level of individual cellular machinery, to respond to it. Anakin's jaw tightened slightly, the only visible indication that what he was doing required anything of him at all. At 2 minutes and 51 seconds, 9 minutes and 51 seconds total since death, well past every threshold Plagueis's own research had established as absolute, the cardiac sensor registered a beat. Single, weak, the output of a muscle that had forgotten how to do this and was relearning from a prompt rather than from memory. Then another, 12 seconds later. Then another, 6 seconds after that, the interval compressing as the cellular machinery found its rhythm again the way a stopped clock found its rhythm when the mechanism was re-engaged, not all at once, but in a cascade of remembering, each gear prompting the next. The forest cat breathed. One breath. Shallow, confused, the breath of a body reacquainting itself with the process. Then, another. The cellular respiration sensor climbed from 0 in a slow, definitive arc. The midi-chlorian activity sensor resolved from flicker into sustained signal. The brainwave monitor, last to respond, produced the low-frequency pattern of deep unconsciousness, alive, but not yet returned to anything it would have recognized as itself. Anakin opened his eyes. He looked at the forest cat's chest rising and falling with the focused, assessing attention of someone checking work rather than witnessing a miracle. His hands came off the bench surface. He rolled his right shoulder once, the only concession his body made to the effort involved. Plagueis looked at the monitoring equipment for a long time, at the flatline that was no longer a flatline, at the timestamp in the corner of the screen. 9 minutes and 51 seconds, he said. The threshold was wrong, Anakin said. His voice was even. Or it was right for the technique you were using. The cascade initiates, but the cascade can be reversed if you address the organelle consumption directly rather than trying to restart the cardiac function first. The heart follows. It doesn't lead. Plagueis looked at him. I figured that out at around the 4-minute mark. Anakin added. I should have started there. The forest cat's breathing had steadied into something approaching normal rhythm. Its eyes remained closed. It was alive in every measurable sense. Alive. And apparently undamaged. The monitoring equipment showing no anomalous cellular markers. No signs of the degradation cascade Plagueis had spent a decade documenting in excruciating detail across subjects that had not survived comparable attempts. The organelle consumption, Plagueis said. You reversed it. I paused it first, then reversed it. The midi-chlorians in the affected cells were still present, they were just receiving no signal because there was nothing generating one. Once I gave them a signal they could carry, the machinery had something to respond to. Anakin looked at the cat. It's like the power coupling analogy. The generator wasn't gone. It was just offline. You don't rebuild a generator from scratch. You restart it. Plagueis moved to the bench. He placed 2 fingers against the forest cat's flank and felt its heartbeat, present, regular, warm. He had used Darth Venomous as a test subject for his revival research across an extended series of cycles, employing techniques he had spent 3 decades refining, pushing the boundaries of what midi-chlorian instruction could accomplish in a body that had been made to stop and coaxed back to starting. The final cycle had been terminal, cellular degradation too advanced, the window too long, the accumulated damage of repeated attempts finally exceeding his ability to compensate. Anakin had just revived a specimen dead for nearly 10 minutes, on his first attempt, at 19 years old, and had identified a fundamental error in Plagueis' methodology in the process. He straightened. There is a question, he said carefully, that I have not yet asked you, because the prerequisite understanding for the answer was not yet in place. He looked at Anakin. It is now. Anakin waited. The technique you just used, Plagueis said. What you did with the organelle cascade, the sequencing of cardiac restart, it is specific. It required knowledge of this specimen's cellular architecture in detail no external observer should have had access to. He paused. How did you know what you were looking at inside a dead organism you have never worked with before? A long silence. The monitoring equipment recorded the forest cat's steady vitals into the quiet. I don't know how to explain it in terms that fit the framework, Anakin said. When I go in at depth, when I'm communicating at the midi-chlorian level, it's not like reading a map someone else drew. It's like the map draws itself while I'm looking at it. The cells tell me what they need. I don't assess and then act. The assessment and the action are the same thing. Plagueis was quiet. Is that wrong? Anakin said. No. Plagueis turned back to the monitoring equipment, to the vitals scrolling across the screen in their steady living rhythm. It is what I suspected, and could not confirm without demonstration. He paused. You are not learning this discipline. You are remembering it. Outside the laboratory's single viewport, Sojourn's dark forest pressed close to the glass. Indifferent and ancient, the way living things were that had existed long enough to stop requiring witnesses. The forest cat opened its eyes. It looked at Anakin. It did not look at Plagueis. Naboo from the approach looked like something a painter had invented to make other planets feel inadequate. Green continents bleeding into lakes so clear the orbital sensors read them as mirrors. Cities that had been built to complement the landscape rather than replace it, their domed architecture rising from the hills like a second geology. The afternoon light at this latitude turned everything amber, the kind of light that made even industrial infrastructure look considered. Anakin had not been here before. He had read about it extensively. The shuttle descended through a cloud layer and leveled above the capital. Theed's palace caught the light on its copper domes and held it. Below, the plaza of the Naboo stretched in its familiar configuration, familiar because he had studied the city's architectural records, its traffic patterns, its security rotations. Because Plagueis had a standing investment in 3 Naboo commercial entities, and Anakin had done the due diligence on all of them. He knew this city the way he knew most things, from the infrastructure outward. She agreed to the meeting, Plagueis said from across the cabin, without looking up from the document he was reading. Not without reservation. What kind of reservation? The kind a sitting senator has when a banking clan figure requests a private consultation with no formal agenda filed. He turned a page. She is intelligent, and she is cautious, which are the same quality at different magnifications. She agreed because the alternative was declining a meeting with Damask Holdings, which is the kind of decision that requires justification in a way that accepting does not. He paused. She will arrive with questions. Have answers that are true. All of them? The relevant ones. He set the document down. Senator Amidala does not need to know what sojourn is. She needs to know that the investment proposal is genuine, that the terms are fair, and that the banking clan's interest in Naboo's reconstruction fund is structural rather than predatory. He looked at Anakin, all of which is true. Anakin looked out the viewport at the approaching palace. You want me to handle the meeting. I want you to conduct the meeting. I will be present. I will not be primary. Plagueis' voice carried the particular quality it had when a statement was also a test. You are 22 years old. You have managed 3 subsidiary negotiations independently this year. This one has a variable the others did not. The variable, Plagueis said, is that Senator Amidala is not a corporation. She is a person with a political history that includes a blockade, an occupation, and the loss of a chancellor she trusted. She has specific categories of wariness that a balance sheet cannot address. He picked up the document again. That is why you are handling the meeting. She was already in the consultation room when they arrived, which was a choice. Arriving before the party that had requested the meeting was a rebalancing of the power dynamic that most politicians deployed unconsciously, and Padmé Amidala almost certainly deployed deliberately. She stood at the window overlooking the palace gardens rather than sitting, which accomplished the same thing from a different angle. She was 24, 2 years older than Anakin. She had been queen at 14, senator at approximately 22, and she carried both tenures the way load-bearing architecture carried weight, not visibly, but structurally, in the way she occupied a room. She turned when they entered. Her eyes moved to Plagueis first, a brief, professional assessment, the evaluation of a politician who had learned to read rooms by reading the most powerful person in them. Then to Anakin, where they stayed a fraction of a second longer than social protocol required. He had been looked at this way before. Not often, but enough to recognize it. The recalibration look. The adjustment a person made when what they saw did not match what they had prepared for. She had prepared for a banking clan representative in some variation of Plagueis' measured mold. What they had sent was something that did not fit the category cleanly. Senator Amidala, Plagueis said. Thank you for receiving us. Magister Damask. Her voice was even, the trained neutrality of a public career. And this is Anakin Skywalker, Anakin said. I'll be leading the presentation of the investment proposal, if that's acceptable. A beat. The recalibration look again, briefer this time, filed and set aside. Of course, she said. The proposal was genuine. This was the foundation Plagueis had built it on, and Anakin had verified the math 3 times because genuine proposals, in his experience, were more disorienting to sophisticated counterparts than manipulative ones. Naboo's post-occupation reconstruction fund had a specific capital gap in its infrastructure tier. Water reclamation systems in the southern provinces, agricultural logistics in the Lake Country, that Republic appropriations had not filled and were not scheduled to fill within the next 4 years. Damask Holdings was offering a structured credit facility at rates below the Commerce Guild's prevailing offer, with a repayment schedule tied to Naboo's agricultural export revenue rather than fixed calendar terms. He walked her through it without theater. Numbers, terms, mechanism, exit provisions. She listened with the quality of attention that meant she was not listening to the presentation, but to the spaces between the terms, looking for the architecture underneath, which was, Anakin noted distantly, exactly what he did with financial reports. The exit provisions, she said when he finished. If Naboo's export revenue falls below the threshold trigger for 3 consecutive quarters, the repayment schedule converts to a fixed term at a rate 2 points above the initial. Correct. That's the risk transfer mechanism. She said it without accusation. Analytically, the downside risk of agricultural underperformance shifts to Naboo rather than to Damask Holdings. Yes, Anakin said. In exchange for the below-market initial rate and the revenue-linked structure, which provides protection against the most likely adverse scenario, a harvest shortfall in the first 2 years while the reclamation infrastructure is still coming online. Most likely, not all likely. No credit facility eliminates all risk. This one prices the most probable risks correctly and leaves the tail risks with the party best positioned to manage them. Naboo's agricultural sector, which has historical resilience data across 3 centuries, versus a fixed payment schedule that has none. He paused. I can show you the comparative default modeling against the Commerce Guild's fixed-term offer. She looked at him for a moment, not the recalibration look, something more direct. Show me, she said. 2 hours later, the gardens outside the window had moved from amber into the deeper gold of approaching evening. The documents were spread across the table. Amidala had asked 14 questions, 8 of which had required Anakin to access additional modeling data, and had made 2 specific requests for amended terms, a reduced conversion rate in the exit provision, and a grace period on the threshold trigger, both of which were within the range Plagueis had pre-authorized, and both of which Anakin had agreed to after the appropriate interval of consideration. Plagueis had said 11 words in 2 hours, all of them confirmatory. There was a pause in the technical conversation, the natural pause that arrived when the substantive work was done, and the remaining distance to agreement was social, rather than analytical. Amidala was looking at the amended terms document. Anakin was looking at the garden. "You're not from the banking clan," she said. He turned. "No, how long have you worked with Magister Damask?" 13 years. The calculation moved across her face briefly. He had been 9. She had been 11. And Queen within a few years of that. And the occupation had happened. And Plagueis had been financing the Republic's political substrate for the entirety of her public life, without her knowledge. None of this was visible in his expression. He had learned over 13 years the specific discipline of knowing things without the knowledge showing. "You know this proposal better than most bankers know their own products," she said. "I wrote it." Another beat. The look she gave him this time was different from either of the previous ones, less assessment, more the expression of someone revising a category they thought was settled. "Why Naboo?" she said. "Specifically, there are capital gaps in 40 sectors with better return profiles than Southern Province water reclamation." The honest answer and the strategic answer were, as Plagueis had said they would be, the same answer. "Naboo has been mishandled twice in 10 years, Anakin said, once by a blockade, and once by an occupation, both of which were political events dressed as economic ones. The underlying assets are sound. The agricultural base, the export infrastructure, the human capital, none of it was damaged by either event. Only the financing environment was damaged." He paused. Sound assets in a damaged financing environment are the most consistently mispriced thing in the galaxy. The return profile follows from correcting the mispricing. She looked at him for a moment longer than she had looked at anything else in the meeting. "I'll have my office send the countersigned terms by end of week," she said. Plagueis said nothing on the shuttle back. He read his document. Anakin looked out at Naboo's amber light, fading into the dark of the upper atmosphere. At some altitude, the planet disappeared below the cloud layer. The feeling the meeting left behind was not satisfaction exactly. It was the specific quality of something begun, a thread introduced into a larger weave, its final pattern not yet visible, but its tension already registered by everything it touched. He did not examine it further. There was work to do. The report crossed Mace Windu's desk on a Thursday, which was not significant except that Thursday was the day the Council reviewed financial crime referrals from the Republic Intelligence Directorate, and the report had been filed under financial crime because the analyst who wrote it did not have a better category for what she had found, and financial crime was the closest existing box. Mace read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at the wall. The analyst's name was Den Tor, a mid-level directorate researcher with 14 years of experience in corporate structure mapping. Her report was 63 pages. The executive summary was 4 sentences. The first sentence identified Damask Holdings as the common parent entity of a network of subsidiaries, holding vehicles, and managed funds that collectively held controlling or significant minority stakes in entities representing, by her conservative estimate, 31% of the Republic's commercial banking infrastructure, 19% of its heavy manufacturing capacity, and 11% of the Senate's campaign financing across 42 member worlds over the previous decade. The second sentence noted that this level of concentrated economic influence had no precedent in the Republic's recorded history. The third sentence noted that none of it was illegal. The fourth sentence said, "The question this report cannot answer is what it is for." Mace picked the report up again and read the fourth sentence a third time. He was in the council chamber within the hour. The discussion occupied most of the afternoon session. Yoda listened from his chair with the specific quality of stillness he deployed when he had already formed a view and was waiting for the room to arrive at it independently. "Concentrated, this influence is," he said, when the discussion had run its initial course. "In the Force also. A presence. Measured old. You've felt it before?" Ki-Adi-Mundi asked. "Noticed it. Long ago. A quality of patience." Yoda's ears lowered slightly. "Patience that is not waiting. Patience that is building." Mace looked at the report in his hands. The banking clan connection puts Damask at the center of at least 3 major policy decisions in the last 8 years that we now know were economically rather than politically driven. The Outer Rim Trade Corridor expansion, the Commerce Guild pension restructuring, the Quat procurement revision. He set the report on the table, all of which produced outcomes that strengthened Damask Holdings' position without a single visible intervention. "Invisible hands," Plo Koon said. "Invisible and unrushed." Mace looked around the table. "Whoever this is, whatever this is, it is not operating on a political timetable. It is operating on something longer." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the council chamber windows, Coruscant's afternoon traffic moved in its endless circuits. "A Sith," Adi-Gallia said. "Not a question." The Force signature Yoda is describing is consistent with what we would expect from a dark side practitioner of significant age and discipline, Mace said. But it is not loud. There is no malice in the conventional sense. No anger, no aggression. Which is either genuinely anomalous or a level of concealment we have not encountered before. "Both," Yoda said. "Both. It can be." Mace looked at him. "Then we investigate. Carefully, one person, unsanctioned. No council mandate until we have something the mandate can be built on. We need someone who can enter a financial environment without looking like a Jedi investigating a financial environment." The room considered its membership. "Kenobi," Mace said. Obi-Wan accepted the assignment with the equanimity he brought to most things, which was not the same as enthusiasm but was indistinguishable from it at a distance. He spent 2 weeks building a cover identity, a mid-level Commerce Guild compliance auditor named Ennio Barrack, with a fabricated employment history that Dentor's own records inadvertently supported, and another week mapping the entry points into Damask Holdings' structure that a compliance auditor might plausibly have reason to access. The entry point he found was a subsidiary 3 layers removed from Damask Holdings proper, a logistics management firm called Varus Transit, which held contracts with 4 banking clan member institutions and filed quarterly compliance reports with the Commerce Guild's External Audit Division. Varus Transit's Coruscant office was staffed by 12 people, none of whom were Force-sensitive, and its records showed 3 outstanding procedural flags from the Guild's previous audit cycle. Outstanding procedural flags were an auditor's reason for existing. He spent 6 weeks inside Varus Transit. He was thorough and undramatic, and resolved 2 of the 3 outstanding flags, which made him useful enough to the staff that they stopped paying attention to him in the particular way that people stopped paying attention to furniture. The 3rd flag led, through a chain of document cross-references that had the quality of a door left slightly ajar, to a parent entity filing. The parent entity was a holding vehicle called Sojourn Capital Management. Sojourn Capital Management's registered address was a Commerce Guild postbox on Munilinst. Its sole listed director was a legal entity rather than a person, a trust instrument administered by a law firm that had represented Damask Holdings for 60 years. Its asset holdings were not publicly registered, but its banking relationships were, because banking relationships left traces in the interbank settlement system that even 60 years of careful legal architecture could not entirely eradicate. One of those relationships, A credit facility, active, recently amended, had a counterparty on Naboo. Obi-Wan looked at the counterparty disclosure for a long time. Then he closed the file, returned the physical records to their correct locations, and spent the remainder of the day auditing payroll compliance, with the focused attention of a man who had just found a thread and was deciding how to pull it without pulling it visibly. The facility on Sojourn did not appear in any record Obi-Wan could find, which was itself the record. Sojourn as a location existed in historical banking clan archives, hunting retreats, private gatherings, the kind of elite social infrastructure that left traces in old expense reports and oblique memoir references. But no current satellite survey showed active construction. No energy consumption data registered in the Republic Utility Monitoring Network. No shipping manifests listed Sojourn as a destination. A place that consumed energy and received supply shipments and registered nothing in the networks that tracked energy and supply was a place that was specifically managing its absence from those networks. That management required resources. Resources left traces if you looked in the right places. He looked in the right places for 3 weeks. What he found was not a location but a pattern. A series of small, irregular cargo movements through a relay point in the carry-on sector, each individually unremarkable, collectively describing a supply chain for a facility that did not officially exist. He filed a brief report to Mace, 4 paragraphs, no conclusions, a request for a navigation database query he could not run from a Commerce Guild terminal. The query came back in 6 days. The relay point's traffic pattern, overlaid on carry-on sector cartography, produced a probability cone that covered 4 possible destination coordinates. He eliminated 3 of them through cross-reference with existing survey data. The 4th was a moon with no registered name in current Republic records, and a historical footnote in a 60-year-old banking clan property transfer document that listed it as a secondary asset of Damask Holdings. Value, negligible, condition, undeveloped. Undeveloped. He chartered a nondescript transport under the Barrack identity and filed a flight plan to a commercial waypoint in the Tingle Arm. He did not file a flight plan to the moon. He diverted at the waypoint, running silent on secondary drives, and made the approach at an angle that kept the moon's own horizon between his ship and the facility's probable sensor array for the final 90 minutes of the descent. The landing was rough, a shallow ravine 2 kilometers from the facility's outer perimeter, his transport sitting at an angle that would make departure interesting. He did not think about departure yet. The perimeter was sophisticated and looked like terrain. He spent 40 minutes getting through it with the focused patience of a man who had been trained to notice things that had been designed not to be noticed. The outer corridors of the facility were clean and empty, and temperature-controlled to a precision that indicated medical or scientific use. The records room he found in the eastern wing held 6 years of research documentation in a filing system, organized by subject rather than by date. The subjects were numbered, not named. The documentation for subjects 1 through 14 occupied 3 data cores and described, in the flat clinical language of genuine scientific record-keeping, a series of experiments whose nature he spent 20 minutes reading and did not fully absorb. Subject 15's file was thinner, more recent. Still active, he was still reading when he heard footsteps in the corridor, not hurried, not stealthy, simply the footsteps of someone who lived here and was going somewhere. And then the corridor door opened, and the footsteps stopped. Obi-Wan looked up from the data core. A young man stood in the doorway. 22, perhaps, dressed in the clean, unadorned clothing of someone for whom appearance was a considered choice rather than a performance. His posture was completely still in the way that suggested the stillness was natural rather than trained. The specific quality of a being for whom the body was simply not a source of noise. He looked at Obi-Wan with an expression that was not alarm, not aggression, not the expression of someone who had found an intruder in their home. It was closer to mild interest. The force around him was unlike anything Obi-Wan had felt in 22 years of Jedi training. Not the structured presence of a practitioner, not the unformed brightness of an untrained sensitive. Something denser. Something that did not radiate outward the way force presence usually radiated but simply was. The way gravity simply was, a property of the space he occupied rather than a thing he was doing. Recognition moved through Obi-Wan 2 seconds later. Not of the face, he had never seen the face, of the name from the file he was holding. Subject 15. Active. "You're Anakin Skywalker," Obi-Wan said. The young man in the doorway looked at him with that expression of mild, undisturbed interest. "And you," Anakin Skywalker said, "have been very difficult to notice." He said it the way someone paid a small, genuine compliment to a thing that had almost worked. The lightsaber came out of Obi-Wan's coat in a single practiced motion, the draw of someone who had performed it 10,000 times, and whose body no longer required instruction to complete it. The blue blade ignited in the records room's clean light and cast everything in two colors, the blade's cold azure and the room's neutral white, layered over each other, producing shadows that couldn't decide what temperature to be. Anakin looked at it. Not at Obi-Wan. At the lightsaber. With the specific quality of attention he gave to things that were technically impressive and categorically outdated, the expression of a physician shone a medicinal leech by someone who believed in its efficacy. "You won't need that," he said. "I'll make that determination." Obi-Wan kept the blade between them, his stance settling into the second form's foundational guard, weight distributed, saber angled across the center line, years of muscle memory making the geometry automatic. Step away from the dedicors. Anakin didn't move. He looked at the lightsaber for another moment, the way someone looked at a map of a place they had already left, and then his attention returned to Obi-Wan's face. "You've been in the compliance office at Varys Transit for 6 weeks, Anakin said. Ennio Barrack. Commerce Guild Auditor. The Barrack identity is well constructed. The employment history is internally consistent. The Guild records support it. And you resolved 2 outstanding procedural flags, which was a genuinely useful thing to do and probably helped the cover more than anything else." He paused. "The 3rd flag was the door. I imagine you know that now." Obi-Wan said nothing. The blade held its position. The flag was left open deliberately. Anakin continued. "Not as a trap. As a filter. Someone following the financial architecture would find it. Someone following an unrelated audit trail would close it and move on." He tilted his head slightly. "You found it. Which told us something. The word us registered." Obi-Wan kept his breathing even. "Where is Plagueis?" he said. "Not here." Anakin's voice was factual. "You'll want to maintain the guard position. I understand the instinct, but I want to be clear with you about something before this proceeds further than it needs to." He looked at the blade again, briefly. "A lightsaber is a tool for beings who haven't found a more direct method. I mean that as description, not insult. You were trained in an institution that has used this tool for 1,000 years, and it is an extraordinary tool for what it does. For what I do, it is unnecessary. What you do," Obi-Wan said, "I've been reading about for 20 minutes. Step away from the cores. The cores aren't what matters." Anakin moved, not toward Obi-Wan, sideways, 3 steps that brought him to the far end of the records room, putting more distance between them rather than less, giving the lightsaber room. The gesture had the quality of something calculated to read as non-threatening and being non-threatening simultaneously, which was its own kind of precision. "What matters is that you found this facility, which means the Jedi Council knows this facility exists. Which means the variable Plagueis identified 3 weeks ago has resolved on the earlier end of the probability range." "What variable?" "That the Order would eventually look in the right direction." Anakin said it without tension. "You were always going to." The question was timeline. Obi-Wan crossed the room in 4 steps, the fastest approach that kept the blade's reach between them, and was halfway through the motion when it happened. No sound. No visual component. No discharge of force energy he could feel or block or redirect. The signals simply changed, not in the room. In him, in the specific geography of his own nervous system, somewhere behind the eyes and above the jaw, a region he had never had cause to think about, because it had never before been a region that required attention. His vision grayed at the periphery. Not dramatically, a narrowing. The way vision narrowed in genuine cold. The circulatory system making executive decisions about resource allocation. His legs continued their forward motion for 1 more step, and then the forward motion was no longer available, not because of anything he could feel, or push against, or apply a counter technique to, simply because the legs had received different information than he had sent them. He stopped. The blade stayed lit. His grip on it held. That stayed. Whatever was happening had not reached his hands. But the geometry of the room had changed in a way that his body was unable to correct for. He was standing. The blade was between them. He had not fallen. He could not move. "The trigeminal vascular system," Anakin said from across the room. His voice was the same. Measured, faintly apologetic in the way a surgeon's voice was faintly apologetic when explaining a necessary procedure. The blood flow regulation to the motor cortex is extremely precise in humans, more precise than most species, which is one of the things that makes human beings exceptionally capable and also exceptionally specific to work with. He had not raised his hand. He had not made any visible gesture. "I'm not damaging anything, I want to be clear about that. The sensation you're feeling, the peripheral narrowing, the motor restriction, is the result of a temporary reduction in cerebral perfusion to the voluntary motor regions. It reverses completely. There is no structural intervention." Obi-Wan tried to move his arm. The arm received the instruction and did not execute it. The disconnect between intention and response was the most frightening thing he had experienced in 22 years of Jedi service, which had included a Sith Lord on Naboo, and a Mandalorian siege on Galadron, and every dark and difficult thing the Order had sent him toward in the decades since his knighthood. This was not like those things. Those things had been loud. This was the opposite of loud. This was his own body's internal communications infrastructure being rerouted by something that operated below the level where Jedi training had any purchase. He spoke because speaking was available. "Anakin." The young man looked at him. The mild interest had shifted slightly, not to cruelty, not to satisfaction, to something that was closer to grief, or the intellectual shape that grief made in a person who processed emotion through analysis. "You know what I could have been," Obi-Wan said. He was not performing the line. It arrived from somewhere below calculation, from the part of a Jedi's training that connected sensing to speaking without the editorial layer in between. If someone had found him first. The silence in the records room was the specific silence of a thing that was true landing in a space where truth was rare enough to be noticed. Anakin was quiet for 7 seconds. The gray at Obi-Wan's vision periphery neither advanced nor retreated. "I know," Anakin said. "I've thought about that." He said it simply, not as a weapon, as a fact that he had turned over and examined and returned to its place. "The Jedi would have found me. Eventually, possibly, the variables that brought Magister Damask to Coruscant on that specific week include the Trade Federation summit and a navigational routing preference his travel coordinator filed 18 months earlier. Change either variable and we are not having this conversation." He paused. "I don't find the alternate scenario useful to inhabit." "I do," Obi-Wan said. Another silence. "The Order," Anakin said. "What do they know?" "Specifically, that Damask Holdings represents an unprecedented concentration of economic influence, that the Force signature associated with it is old and disciplined and dark, that there is a facility on this moon." Obi-Wan kept his voice level. "That someone is here." Anakin nodded. "Once processing, the Jedi are not the threat I am concerned with," he said. "I want you to understand that as a statement of strategic assessment, not dismissal. The Order's capabilities in this domain, economic intelligence, systemic analysis, the kind of threat that operates through compound interest rather than open conflict, are structurally limited. You are the exception. The analyst who found the Varys transit thread is another exception." He looked at Obi-Wan directly. "Exceptions matter. I'm not dismissing you." "Then release me," Obi-Wan said. "Yes," Anakin said it without drama. In a moment, he moved to the records room door and opened it. 2 facility security droids waited in the corridor, not combat models. The same medical administrative design as 11-4D. They will escort you to your transport. The coordinates of your landing site have been noted since your arrival. Your ship will be undamaged. The gray at Obi-Wan's vision periphery dissolved. His legs received his instructions again. The return of voluntary function was as undramatic as its removal. No pain, no residual sensation. Simply the body back under its own management. He did not move immediately. He stood in the records room with the lightsaber still lit and looked at the young man in the doorway. "The Order will respond to this," he said. "I know." Anakin's expression held that quality again, the grief-shaped thing. That's the variable that just resolved. He looked at Obi-Wan for a moment longer. "I'm sorry about what happens next. I mean that, without qualification." He stepped back from the doorway. The droids waited. The lightsaber in Obi-Wan's hand felt, for the first time in 22 years of carrying one, like exactly what Anakin had called it. A tool for beings who hadn't found a more direct method. He extinguished the blade and walked through the door. Obi-Wan's report to the council ran 40 minutes. He delivered it standing, which was not his usual practice, but sitting felt wrong for what the report contained, as though the weight of it required a posture that at least implied readiness, even if readiness was no longer the operative condition. He covered the facility's layout, the research documentation, the 14 numbered subjects in their data cores, the scale of what Sojourn Capital Management represented as a financial instrument. He covered Anakin Skywalker in the same flat, precise language he had used for everything else, because the flat, precise language was the only container he had found that could hold the description without distorting it. When he finished, the council chamber was quiet for 11 seconds. He counted them. Yoda's eyes were closed, not in meditation, in the specific expression he wore when he was listening to something the room could not hear. "The apology," Mace said, at the end. He said he was sorry about what happens next. Yes, he knew we would respond. He said the variable had resolved, that us knowing about the facility was the variable. Obi-Wan paused. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't concerned. He stopped. Tried again. He was the way a person was when they had been waiting for a scheduled event to arrive, not dreading it, not anticipating it, simply noting its arrival. Mace looked at the table. Ki-Adi-Mundi looked at Mace. Adi Gallia looked at Yoda. Yoda opened his eyes. "Time," he said. "We do not have it." They were right that they did not have it. What they did not know, could not have known, because the mechanism that was already in motion was not visible to force sense, or intelligence analysis, or any instrument the Order possessed, was that the schedule Anakin had referenced in his statement about resolved variables was not a contingency they had triggered. It was a completion they had walked into. The facility modification had been made 6 days before Obi-Wan's transport touched down in the ravine. Not in response to his presence, in response to the probability calculation Anakin had run 3 weeks prior, when the Varys transit thread showed its first signs of being followed. The modification itself had taken 11 hours across 2 separate laboratory sessions, working from a biological agent profile that had been theoretical for 2 years, and required only the final synthesis stage to become operational. The agent was not a toxin. Toxins were imprecise. They damaged indiscriminately, produced visible symptoms, triggered immune responses that created detectable signatures in population health monitoring. What Anakin had built was more specific than a toxin in the same way that a key was more specific than a crowbar. A key did not break the door. It communicated with the lock's own mechanism, and the lock opened from the inside. The agent communicated with midi-chlorians, specifically with one variant of the protein expression pathway that differentiated force-sensitive midi-chlorian populations from standard ones, a variant Anakin had first identified at 17 while working on the reversal methodology, a variant Plagueis had spent 4 months verifying because the implications of its existence were significant enough to warrant verification 4 times before. They were acted upon. The variant was present in every force-sensitive being Plagueis had catalogued in 6 decades of research. It was the molecular flag that said, "This organism's midi-chlorians are an active force communion." The agent did not destroy the midi-chlorians. Destroying them would have required a concentration that made broad delivery impractical. It disrupted the pathway. Folded the variant protein into a configuration that blocked the force communion channel without damaging the underlying cellular machinery. The midi-chlorians remained present, alive, functional, in every biological sense. They simply stopped transmitting. The force-sensitive organism was not harmed. They were healthy. They continued to breathe, to eat, to sleep. They simply could not reach the Force, and the Force could not reach them, and the silence where the connection had been was a silence with no echo and no bottom. The delivery mechanism was water. The Jedi Temple's water reclamation system was a closed-loop infrastructure that had operated without significant modification for 200 years. It drew from Coruscant's municipal deep water reserve, filtered through the temple's own processing units, and circulated through every point of consumption in the building. Drinking, cooking, sanitation, the irrigation lines for the temple gardens, the cooling systems for the training saber rooms, the humidification units that kept the archives at the correct atmospheric level for document preservation. A maintenance access point for the filtration system existed in a service corridor on the temple's sub-level 4. The access point required a maintenance authorization credential to open. The credential format had been obtained through a Damask Holdings subsidiary that held a facilities management contract with the Coruscant Municipal Works Authority, which had a reciprocal access protocol with the temple's administrative office for emergency infrastructure maintenance. The reciprocal access protocol had been in place for 11 years. The introduction took 4 minutes and produced no observable event, no sound, no visual anomaly. The water continued to move through the system in its normal circulation pattern, and the agent moved with it. And by the time the morning meditation session began in the temple's main hall, the water had reached every corner of the building once, and was beginning its second circulation. The first indication was a Padawan named Sola Den. She was 13. She had been with the Order for 9 years. Brought from Corellia at 4 years old after the Creche evaluation found a midi-chlorian count that her intake assessor had described in the file as exceptional for her age group. She was in the middle of a levitation exercise in Training Room 7, a set of 6 small stones arranged on a practice mat, each lifted and held in a specific geometric configuration that required simultaneous concentration across multiple telekinetic points. The stones dropped, all 6, simultaneously, at 0847 hours. They hit the mat with the small, flat sounds of objects that had simply been released, rather than lost. Sola Den looked at them. She reached for the Force the way she had reached for it every morning of her remembered life, the way breathing reached for air, automatic, below the level of conscious decision, a function as basic as any her body performed. The reaching found nothing. Not resistance, not a wall, not the dark, pressured absence that the temple's historical records described as force suppression artifacts or as Salamiri fields. Just silence. The ordinary silence of a room, without anyone in it. She reached again, the way a person repeated a word that had suddenly stopped sounding like a word. The silence repeated. She sat down on the mat next to the 6 stones. She was 13 years old, and she had not been without the Force for a single waking hour in 9 years, and she did not have language for what was happening, because no language for it had ever been necessary. At 0851, Training Room 7's supervising knight felt it. At 0853, the adjacent training room's master felt it, or rather stopped feeling the Force, which in its own way was the loudest possible thing to feel. By 0900, the council chamber had 3 masters in it, who had come without being summoned, because the summons channel had also gone quiet. Yoda sat in his chair. His eyes were open. His expression was the expression of a being confronting an event that his centuries of preparation had not included. Not because the preparation was insufficient, but because the event had never existed before. He reached for the Force. Once, the silence answered. He did not reach again. By midday, the temple had the quality of a building in which something structural had failed. Not the walls, not the floors, but something in the relationship between the people inside it and the space they occupied. Masters sat in corridors. Padawans moved in groups, close together, the instinctive clustering of beings whose primary orientation system had stopped functioning. Nobody was running. Nobody was in pain. The silence was not violent. That was the worst of it. That the silence was not violent. Kit Fisto found Plo Koon in the eastern garden, standing at the irrigation border, watching water move through the reclamation channel with an expression that held something between comprehension and the moment before comprehension arrived fully. The water, Plo Koon said, without preamble, without looking up. Kit Fisto looked at the channel. They stood there together for a moment, two Jedi Masters for whom the Force had been as constant as gravity. Watching water move through a garden that was still green, still alive, tended by a system that continued to function perfectly. By 1400 hours, the first Masters had begun filing out through the temple's main entrance into Coruscant's afternoon light. Not fleeing. There was nothing to flee from, simply leaving a building that had become, without violence and without announcement. A building that no longer meant what it had meant when they entered it that morning. By 1800, the temple's administrative office received a communication from the Damask Holdings legal division. It concerned a resettlement assistance program, already funded, already staffed, already in possession of a roster of every temple resident compiled from the Commerce Guild's public census records. The communication was formal and warm, and expressed genuine concern for the well-being of the Order's members during what it described as a period of transition. It had been drafted 4 months ago. 18 months later, the temple was a museum. Not officially. Officially it remained the property of the Jedi Order, administered by a Damask Holdings Cultural Preservation Trust that had assumed operational management at the Order's request. A request that had been drafted by the Damask Holdings legal division and signed without amendment, because the alternative was administering a building full of historical artifacts by an organization that no longer had the infrastructure to administer anything. The trust maintained the structure, cataloged the archives, kept the gardens irrigated. Tour groups came on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The former Jedi lived ordinary lives. This was not a euphemism. The resettlement program had been thorough and genuinely resourced. Housing assistance, vocational transition support, healthcare coverage through a Damask Holdings-affiliated insurer. Obi-Wan Kenobi had, after 3 weeks of refusing all of it, accepted a position at a Republic Civil Mediation Bureau in the Outer Rim. Mace Windu had returned to Harun Kal. Yoda had gone somewhere nobody had recorded, which was his right and also, in a quiet way, the most Yoda-like possible response to the situation. None of them could feel the Force. The agent's effect had proven, in the 18 months since its introduction, to be permanent in the absence of a reversal protocol that only Anakin possessed and had not offered. They were healthy. They were alive. They were, in every measurable sense, ordinary people. Plagueis had reviewed the resettlement program's 18-month outcomes report over breakfast on a Tuesday morning and described it as satisfactory. Padmé knew. Not everything, not Sojourn, not the laboratory, not the 14 data cores or the forest cat or the specific mechanism by which the Jedi Order had lost its connection to the Force between breakfast and lunch on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday. She knew the shape of it the way a person knew the shape of a country they had never visited, but had studied the maps of for long enough to understand the topography. She sat in the apartment that Anakin maintained on Coruscant, not the Damask Holdings suite. A separate residence, small by the standards their resources could have supported. Because Anakin had a preference for spaces that did not require maintenance staff, and watched Coruscant's evening traffic move through the window while he reviewed documents at the table behind her. They had been together for 2 years. The relationship had the texture of most things in Anakin's life, considered before it began, undramatic in its continuance, evidently permanent without having been declared so. The Southern Province Reclamation Project completes next month, he said, without looking up. I know. My office received the completion certification yesterday. She watched a transport navigate the skyway below. The agricultural yields are up 14% from the pre-occupation baseline. 18, according to the Commerce Guild assessment. Your office's figure uses a different baseline year. My office's baseline year is more conservative. Your office's baseline year is more politically defensible, he said. The Guild's figure is more accurate. She almost smiled. Did not quite. Naboo is doing well. Naboo is doing very well. He set the document down. Your family's holding in the Lake Country has appreciated 40% in 3 years. Your sister's children are attending the best school in Theed. The occupation is far enough in the past that the generation entering adulthood now has no memory of it. She heard what the recitation was and was not. It was not a list of things she owed him. It was not leverage. It was an accounting, offered plainly, in the same voice he used for agricultural yield figures and financial instruments. This was what their life looked like, from the outside and from the inside. She had decided, At some point she could not precisely locate. Not to look for the seam between those two views. "I'm going to Naboo next month," she said. "For the completion ceremony, I know. Will you come?" A pause. Not hesitation. Consideration, yes, he said. Sojourn in winter was the color of old iron. The deciduous sections of the forest had dropped their canopy, and what remained were the dark conifers, pressing close to the facility's perimeter in their patient, indifferent permanence. The sky above them was the specific gray of a planet that received its light at an angle. Not cold light, just reduced, as though the star had decided the forest didn't need full brightness to go about its business. Plagueis stood at the facility's main viewport with his hands behind his back. The posture had not changed in the 40 years Anakin had known him. The body inside it had changed, more slowly than an unaugmented moon's body would have changed. The midi-chlorian work visible in the absence of the usual markers of his age. But the posture was constant. The posture of a being who had long ago decided that the observable world was something you engaged with directly, without the intermediary of furniture or comfort. Anakin stood beside him. Between them, on the viewport's lower ledge, a data slate showed the banking clan's quarterly consolidated report. Damask Holdings' direct and indirect holdings now represented the largest single economic position in the Republic's history. Not publicly. The architecture of subsidiaries and managed funds and trust instruments meant that no public record connected the pieces into a picture that read as what it was. But the pieces were there, and they moved when Plagueis decided they should move, and the Republic moved with them the way a body moved with its own circulatory system, not noticing the mechanism, only the result. Quat Drive Yards filed their board transition documents this morning, Anakin said. I saw. Plagueis watched the forest. The new chair is adequate. She's better than adequate. She restructured their labor contracts in the Tingle Arm division without being asked, and without the restructuring costing the company anything it wasn't already losing to turnover. He paused. She thinks she did it independently. She did do it independently. The conditions that made the restructuring obvious to her were arranged. The conclusion was hers. Plagueis tilted his head slightly. That is not manipulation. That is environment. Anakin was quiet for a moment. Outside, the dark conifers moved in Sojourn's winter wind. Unhurried, the Jedi, he said. Not as a question. What about them? Do you miss the opposition? Plagueis considered this with the genuine consideration he gave to questions that were worth considering. Not long, 4 seconds, which for him was long. No, he said. I miss the precision it required. The opposition itself was a cost. He looked at the forest. What I find, now that the cost is gone, is that I do not miss paying it. I miss only the quality of attention that paying it demanded. Anakin looked at the quarterly report on the data slate, at the numbers that represented, in aggregate, a civilization's economic substrate under unified management for the first time in 1,000 years. The number was very large. It sat on the slate with the same visual weight as any other number. We could begin the longevity protocols, Anakin said. Formally, the theoretical work is complete. The synthesis pathway is ready. I know. The first full cycle would take 14 months. The maintenance phase after that is indefinite. He looked at Plagueis. Which is the point? Plagueis was quiet for a long moment. The gray light moved through the viewport and lay across the floor between them in its flat, even distribution. Begin the protocols, he said. No ceremony. No formal acknowledgement of what the instruction represented, that the question Plagueis had spent 60 years asking, the question that had driven 14 failed experiments and 1 successful one, and the reorganization of a civilization's economic foundations, had resolved. That the answer was standing beside him, looking out at a winter forest on a moon the Senate believed was undeveloped. Preparing to make mortality optional for the first time in the history of a species that had always treated it as a law. It had resolved like most things in this facility resolved. Quietly, during a conversation about something else. Coruscant's lights, from the viewport of the Damask Holdings Tower, were indistinguishable from what they had been 18 months ago. Or 7 years ago. Or 30 years ago. The planet city burned its permanent burn. 10,000 lanes of traffic in their endless circuits. The Senate rotunda lit from within, amber and self-important, presiding over a political surface that moved in the directions it was inclined to move, like water finding its level. Anakin stood at the window alone. Behind him, the quarterly report sat on the table. The resettlement program outcomes, the Quat drive yards filing, the Naboo agricultural yield figures in their two competing versions, both of which were true from different distances. The longevity protocol synthesis pathway, printed and annotated in his own hand, ready for morning. The Republic breathed below him. Its citizens went about the business of their lives. Commerce and politics and the ordinary machinery of 10,000 inhabited worlds, doing what inhabited worlds did. They were, by every measurable standard, fine. The occupation of Naboo was a historical footnote. The separatist crisis that had once threatened to fracture the Republic's outer territories had been quietly absorbed into a series of trade renegotiations before it hardened into open conflict. The Jedi Order existed as a cultural institution administered by a preservation trust, its archives open to scholars on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Nobody was coming. There was no prophecy left to fulfill, no balance left to restore, because the force that had spent 1,000 years accumulating toward this moment had accumulated, and the moment had arrived. And the moment looked like this: a man at a window in a city that did not know it had been solved, watching traffic that did not know it was a circulatory system, in a galaxy that was. For the first time in its history, arranged, he looked at his reflection in the glass. The face looked back at him with its accustomed calm. Somewhere below, in the apartment that was small by the standards their resources could have supported, Padmé was reading the completion certification from the Southern Province Reclamation Project. Her office's conservative baseline figures annotated in the margin in her precise, unhurried hand. She would take those figures to Naboo next month. He would go with her. The copper domes of Theed would catch the afternoon light the way they always caught it, and the lake country would be exactly what the agricultural data said it was, and her sister's children would be in school. And the generation that remembered the occupation would be older by one more year, and the generation that did not remember it would be 1 year closer to inheriting a planet that had no idea what its recovery had cost, or who had paid for it. He did not find this troubling. He had examined the thing from every angle available to him, and arrived, consistently, at the same conclusion, that the cost had been paid by people who had dedicated their lives to a structure that was itself the problem, and that the structure had been replaced by something quieter and more durable, and that the galaxy below the window was, by every measure he could apply to it, better arranged than it had been. The math resolved cleanly. It always had. He thought, briefly, of Obi-Wan Kenobi in a civil mediation bureau somewhere in the Outer Rim, doing work that was useful and unglamorous and entirely without the Force, which was the only life available to him now, and which he was, by all accounts that reached Anakin through the usual channels, conducting with the same equanimity he had brought to everything else. He thought of Yoda, somewhere unrecorded, which was the most honest possible response to a situation that had no honest response. He thought of a 13-year-old Padawan sitting on a practice mat, beside 6 fallen stones, reaching for something that was no longer there, and finding instead the ordinary silence of an ordinary room. He held that thought for a moment longer than he held the others. Then he set it down. Below, the city burned on. It would burn tomorrow and the day after that and every day that followed, in its endless, indifferent circuits, carrying its 10 billion lives in their 10 billion directions, none of them aware that the substrate beneath everything they did and built and believed had been quietly, permanently, irrevocably settled by a boy found sorting components in a mid-level market on a night the planet had not noticed and would not remember. "It's done," Anakin said, to no one in particular. It was not triumph in his voice. It was not relief. It was the quality a proof had when the last line resolved and the work was complete, and what remained was simply everything the proof implied. Permanent. Settled. And already, in every way that mattered, accepted, he turned from the window. There was work to do tomorrow. There would be work to do every day after that, which was, in the end, exactly what forever looked like. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.